This is the part 2 to part 4 of the RA 9271. This is Clyde Salundaguit, and let's start. Section 7, Vessels to be inspected. So vessels cleared in one port in the Philippines are deemed cleared for all other ports in the country except in cases of infectious disease, emerging disease, or public health emergency. Section 8, we have requirements for vessels to be inspected. So any vessel coming from foreign ports subject to quarantine inspection shall be considered in quarantine until given a pratik. So such vessel shall fly a yellow flag at its foremost upon entry into the harbor, drop its anchor, and wait for the quarantine medical officer. Section 9, Requirements from the Master of Vessels to be inspected. So the first sub-information is that the Master of the vessel shall provide the quarantine medical officer the following duly accomplished documents. We have the Maritime Declaration of Health, the rating or the derating exemption certificate, passenger and crew list, the voyage memo, the clinical record of cases treated during the voyage, if any, and lastly is the other documents deemed necessary to the quarantine medical officer for the compliance of health regulations. So the second sub-information is that a shipmaster is required to notify the Bureau of Quarantine as the next port of call or station if he or she has suspected case of an infectious disease. So the last sub-information is that the ship captain may be ordered to muster the crew and passenger on board in well-lighted and ventilated place for inspection when deemed necessary. Section 10, Kinds of pratik issued to incoming vessels. So it has a lot of sub-informations, but to summarize, we have first the free pratik. So it is a pratik issued to a vessel which has complied with quarantine rules and regulations as provided in this IRR. So we also have the provisional pratik, which is a pratik issued to vessels which have the following conditions. So isolation of suspect or actual case of infectious disease. We also have the quarantine or medical surveillance of exposed passengers, and many others. So we also have the controlled free pratik, which is granted to vessels with a request or a direct berthing privilege submitted within 48 hours prior to the estimated time of arrival. So we also have the radio pratik granted to military vessels of the Republic of the Philippines and foreign countries. So the controlled radio pratik is granted to cruise vessels under the different kinds of conditions that is already mandated. Section 11, Immunization Certificate Requirement. So we have the yellow fever. Travelers arriving from the yellow fever infected areas are required to present valid international certificates of vaccination against yellow fever if arriving within 6 days from that area. Section 12, Extent and Method of Quarantine Inspection. During the inspection of vessels, the quarantine medical officer shall check the following conditions before granting a pratik to the vessel. So first, we have the state of health of the passenger. We have the existence or non-existence of an infectious disease, the sanitary conditions on board, and others. Section 13, Boarding of vessel from foreign ports. So the first thing that should be maintained is that no person is allowed to embark except the quarantine medical officer, and then the disembarkation of the passenger and crew is not allowed until such time that the vessel has been granted a quarantine clearance. And suspect case shall be medically evaluated on board, and then the remaining passengers and crew vessels should have been medically evaluated as well. Section 14, the requirements of the vessels before departure. So no vessels shall be allowed to depart from any seaport of the Philippines to foreign destination without securing an outgoing quarantine clearance from the Director of Quarantine or his duly authorized representative. Section 15. Embarkation of travelers for international voyage. So the Director of Quarantine, when he considered it necessary, may order the medical examination of travelers and may disallow of any suspected person of having an infectious disease subject to regulation, emerging disease, and others. Section 16. Personnel assigned for inspection. So in seaport, where there is no quarantine medical officer, a duly trained physician will be designated by the Undersecretary of Health as acting or alternate quarantine medical officer upon the recommendation of the Director of Quarantine. Section 17. Time of vessel quarantine inspection. So the inspection of vessels required by these regulations shall be made between 0800 to 1200 H and 1300 to 1700 H, Mondays to Fridays. So any inspection performed outside of these hours and during Saturdays, Sundays, and holidays shall be compensated for. Section 18. Vessels to be inspected. So all domestic vessels plying domestic ports with the presence of infectious disease, subject to regulations, emerging disease, public health emergency of international concern on board, are subject to quarantine inspection and clearance. Section 19. Requirements of vessels to be inspected. So domestic vessels subject to inspection shall be considered in quarantine and is properly cleared so that the vessels will be perfectly ready to go. The requirements should be prepared. Section 20. We have the requirements from the master of vessels to be inspected. So the master of the vessel shall provide the quarantine medical officer the following duly accomplished documents. We have the clinical records of treated cases during the voyage. We have the rating exemption certificate, the passenger and crew list, the voyage memo, and the other document deemed necessary by the quarantine officer for the compliance of health regulations based on guidelines and protocols. Section 21. We have the immunization requirements. So the Director of Quarantine may from time to time prescribe or require immunization from certain diseases if in his decree census requirements are essential on account of varying public health conditions. Section 22. Extent and method of quarantine inspection. So during the inspection of vessels, the quarantine medical officer shall check the following conditions. So we have the state of health of the passengers and crew, the existence or non-existence of an infectious disease, and others. Section 23. The personnel assigned for inspection of inter-island vessels. So the quarantine inspection of vessels shall be conducted by the quarantine medical officer and a accredited assistant designated by the Director of Quarantine. Section 24. Boarding of domestic vessels placed under quarantine. So in case of notification of the presence of suspected case, so no person is allowed to embark except the quarantine medical officer, and disembarkation of passenger and crew is not allowed until such time that the vessel has been granted a quarantine clearance. Section 25. The requirements of vessels while in port. So rat guards on mooring connection lines. So if vessels docks alongside the piers, all mooring lines shall be provided with prescribed rat guards not less than 1 meter in diameter and so fixed as to be always at right angle to the line which is attached. Section 26. So disposal of garbage. So no vessel shall be allowed to dump garbage or waste overboard while in harbor. So garbages should be collected in prescribed containers for disposal. Section 27. Rat inspection of vessels. So the following vessels shall be subject to rat inspection while in harbor. So the vessels without the rating exemption certificate, the vessels with expired the rating exemption certificate, vessels with valid rating certificate but with moderate to heavy rat infestation aboard. So, Section 28, the fumigation. So, the following are subject to fumigation while in harbor. So, any vessels with human or rodent plague on board, any vessels moderately or heavily infested with rats or other pest vermins. We also have the cargoes in a vessel from a plague-infected port which are vulnerable to harbor rats and fleas.